Morning, everybody. Thought we'd take class outside today and ski. Actually, it looks like I'm skiing backwards, doesn't it? Yeah, while I'm talking to you. There we go. I don't know if you folks ski. I grew up in the Northeast where I learned to ski, and it was absolutely freezing every time we went out. I mean, it was an issue of being able to get enough skiing in before you got too cold to go in. And then when I got to Southern California here, I went skiing the first time. I can't remember what time of year it was, but as you probably know, it's not unpleasant at all in the mountains. In fact, it can get pretty warm up there and still have some nice snow. So I do remember one of the first kind of realizations I had moved to Southern California was seeing some people skiing in bikinis, which maybe you've seen before. And it's pretty astonishing for somebody who grew up in the Northeast in upstate New York to see something like that. But the temperature was fine, and I didn't need a jacket. It was great fun, and you could stay out a lot longer. So I guess it's one of the benefits from one of the benefits of being in Southern California. Anyway, hope you folks are doing well. Let's go ahead and start talking about stuff in the class. Let me get rid of this silly stuff for you. Oh, that's a real hat. Sorry. All right. So what I'm going to do is share our screen with you folks and give you a chance to remind you of what the class is like. Hold on just a second. In terms of the requirements and things like that. I know we've gone over this before, so hopefully you don't have any major questions. But again, just 2 tests, and they'll be the first one will be during week 3. The second one will be during the finals period, the 2-day finals period. You'll be able to take it anytime you want. The second test is not cumulative. It will just be based on the second half of the course. It will be everything that we've learned since the midterm. I should mention there might be a tiny bit of overlap in the sense that one of your discussion sections that comes before the midterm will be will be presenting material that actually will be tested on the final, but we'll work all that out. There's, as you can see already, there's a little bit of a mismatch about what we're presenting in discussion section and what we're presenting in lecture, but that's okay, as long as you're having fun. And remember, the big goal of this course is to, of course, get you to learn the material, but to use the course as kind of an intellectual distraction from everything that's going on. I know I've woke up this morning and all the news seems to be pretty devastating, and I can imagine you folks are feeling the same way. So let's try to, at least for the 3-hour periods on Tuesday and Thursday, and for your discussion section, try to distract ourselves and get really into the material and try to learn something that is not part of the current events, or at least doesn't have a direct relationship to that. I think that probably by now in your young lives, you realize that sometimes one of the best ways for you to kind of ease yourself, calm yourself, is to, seriously engage in some other ideas, whether it's a hobby, whether it's, some sort of intellectual pursuit, whether it's spending time, on Zoom with your friends. If you can engage in something, it helps. It helps relax. It helps kind of ground you. It helps center you. And I'm hoping that's what we can learn from this course, in addition to all the material, that one of the nice ways of centering ourselves is to kind of get, throw ourselves into some intellectual endeavor. And in this case, it's going to be the material in the course and learning about our perceptual superpowers. Okay, hopefully everything else is all set. All the old lectures are linked to the iLearn page. Your slides are there too, at least the slides from previous quarters. There might be some small additions, but we'll talk about those as they come up. And of course, I put a copy of your book up there for you as well. So this should be a very simple course in terms of the mechanics. But let me see if there's any questions about the mechanics before we return to the material we've been discussing, which of course has to do with sound and echolocation. So let's do that. Does anybody have any questions this morning? I just want to make sure, just somebody write yes if you can hear me. Just want to make sure everything's working okay technically. Yeah, can you guys hear me? Yes, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Chase. I appreciate it. Any questions about the course? Any questions about the tests or the book or the material or anything like that? Okay, great, no problem. I should mention, as I'm looking at this background, when I started off the course, this first Zoom course last quarter, I had kind of very calm backgrounds, kind of very, like ocean scenes and mountain scenes that didn't have a lot of dynamics. And then I just for fun started putting things like this in, and students kind of responded to it. They say, yeah, it kind of keeps me awake, it keeps me alerted. Let me know if any of the backgrounds are too distracting, but hopefully these will work for you. I'm happy to change them if we need to. Okay, then let's go ahead and go back to the material. There we go. So let's remind ourselves of what we were discussing the last class. We had gone through an introduction of the class and discussed kind of the main chapters. But then we started talking about the idea of echolocation in some detail. And I know you've learned about this already from your discussion sections. Serena, I know, had you do a demonstration and things like that. And I think it's harder to do a demonstration on your own in your apartments or houses or whatever. We usually do it when we're teaching live. We take the discussion section students and bring them outside and have them do it with the sort of wall that you've seen in this image down here. Oops. Yeah, right here. People are very surprised at how well it works, especially if they're really, really concentrating. If they have a blindfold on, if people are watching them, if they know they're not going to hurt themselves because people are there to make sure they don't bump into the wall. And what we find is not only can people like Daniel Kish do this, but to probably a smaller extent, everybody can do this. So I do not recommend that you go bike riding with a blindfold or even hiking with a blindfold. But if you wanted to take it seriously, you could, try this outside your home a little bit, try it in various places in your home. And what we find is with 15 minutes or so of practice, pretty much everybody we've ever tested in these sorts of experiments can do it. And that's also true of people who've done more of these sort of experiments in their laboratories. But in our laboratory, a number of years ago, we took people outside, and that's what you're seeing there. That's actually a location between Olmsted and the building behind Olmsted. Oh, actually, it's between the two parts of the biology building now. You're seeing that picture. And we took our intro psychology students, brought them out to the location, told them a little bit about echolocation, told them a little bit about Daniel Kish, and then put a blindfold on them and asked them to try their best at echolocating. And what we found is that at first they'd be very self-conscious, they'd be nervous. Very few actually made that clicking sound that we told them Daniel makes. Daniel makes this kind of sound. Hopefully you can hear this okay. Kind of like he's, getting a horse to gallop or something. But most of our subjects, because of their self-consciousness, would just say, hello, hello, testing, testing. We had people say, I feel silly, I feel silly. And it didn't make too much of a difference what sound they were saying. As long as they were making a repeated sound, they were able to perform the task and walk to the wall to stop right before they got there. Of course, as I said, to be good scientists, we had to make sure they weren't counting footsteps, so we had to move the wall at different distances and return them to different locations. Yeah, by using echolocation, they were able to make a sound, have it leave their mouth, have the sound then return to them, and they could hear it. Now, let me just remind you of something very important I said last class, and that has to do with this concept of facial vision. And I don't want people to get confused about this. All that facial vision refers to is how blind people themselves don't have a very good introspective experience about how this works. So Daniel Kish is a perfect example. Daniel's very bright, as I said. He, has 2 master's degrees and is a very eloquent speaker. By the way, if you look on our YouTube site, you'll see I posted a TED Talk from Daniel. You'll get a sense of how articulate he is and how insightful he is. And you ask him what it's like to echolocate, and he will not say, I hear differences in sound for the most part. He'll say he just has an experience of things being out there in front of him. And that's pretty much what most blind people say. If they're forced to make a guess, that's where this facial vision idea came up. They said, I feel pressure on my faces. But that's not true. What they're really using is sound, even though they don't have an introspective experience of sound. So that's the idea behind facial vision, and I put the term awareness. Even the blind, who can be very, very good at this skill, aren't really aware of the way they're doing this, that it is based on sound. And that is exactly the sort of thing that our intro psychology students came in and said that, yeah, I guess I'm doing this now, but it's not like I'm hearing a difference in sound. It just feels like the wall is close to me. It feels like it's going to touch me, you know, almost as if they can feel like something on their skin. That's where this facial vision idea comes out. But, you know, their introspection in this case is wrong. It is based on sound, even though they don't experience it as a sound change. If you try it yourself, that will probably be your experience as well. Well, as it turns out, both the blind and sighted can do more than this with echolocation. For the most part, the blind are better, but sighted people can also learn to determine other things besides, you know, an object's distance, a wall's distance. They can determine the shape of the wall or the shape of the object that's in front of them, and the texture. And let me tell you what I'm referring to for that. What you're seeing here in the bottom right image is somebody in an echolocation experiment. Now, I should say that this is one of these classic echolocation experiments conducted in the 1950s. I told you that, you know, these are old school experiments where, you know, the researchers would dress in lab coats and wear those silly glasses, right? I mean, you know, it really looks like a, you know, kind of 1950s psychology experiment. And whether the person was blind or sighted, they'd have them sit in a chair, and looks like this person's wearing a blindfold, so this might actually be a sighted subject, one of the sighted subjects they ran. And then the experimenters would kind of lower a little pulley system here, so different objects of different shapes and sizes. Actually, that's something I should have put up there. Not only can they do distance, shape, and texture, they can also do size. You can add that to there if you want, if you're taking notes. They would put these objects in front of them and then ask people to echolocate, to go click or just say something, and then try to make a guess as to what object was in front of them, how far away it was, how big it was, and then what it was made out of. Now, that sounds really, really tricky, and I imagine that was one of the trickiest aspects of it. They gave them a small set of choices to use to identify these things. So they only had to choose one of three objects. It either was a disc, a square shape, or a triangle shape. And the textures were either, what does that look like? Wood, metal, or I guess wood covered with some sort of carpeting or something like that. And then there were three sizes. There was this looks like the middle size maybe of the disc, and a small disc and a large disc, and then they were put at three different distances. So imagine there are three dimensions of each of these things. And so what they would do is lower one of these objects and say, okay, time to figure out what this is. Go ahead and echolocate. And they go, hello, testing, testing, click, click, click. They say, I would guess that might be the disc, and it's made out of wood, and it's maybe 2 to 3 feet in front of me. Okay, it's the middle distance that I've been hearing, and it's the medium size. And what they found is that subjects, whether they were blind or sighted, with some practice, could do this at better than chance levels. Okay, they could judge whether it was the disc, square, or triangle. They could judge whether it was the big one, the medium one, or the small one. They could judge whether it was at the close distance, medium distance, far distance. They could judge whether it was wood, metal, or something that was covered with carpet. At better than chance levels. They weren't perfect, but they were good. They had learned to do it. Now, unsurprisingly, the blind were better overall. Someone like Daniel Kish can pretty much ace this. I don't know if a majority of blind people can, probably not, but someone like Daniel Kish, someone like Brian Bushway, who you read about in the chapter, these people would probably ace it. And I think I'll show you some research suggesting that they can probably be more accurate than I'm portraying here in this experiment, which is really interesting. We'll get into some of that research in just a second, but before we do, a couple of other things I want to say. Oops, sorry. Yes. You've already learned that, and this was what our experiment was about when we ran this years ago, we had people either moving towards the board as they were echolocating or standing still at various positions as they were echolocating. And we found that the movement did help them with their accuracy on these judgments. In this particular experiment, it was not one where they had to judge the object's properties, but instead they had to be able to walk to the wall and stop before they got there. They were more accurate at performing that task if in fact they were allowed to move as they were echolocating. So there's something in the sound that's coming to them that's available more readily if they're moving than if they're stationary. Okay, you've already learned about that in the discussion section, so I won't belabor that. Okay. So how are people able to perform these skills? There's still a lot of research that's being conducted on this, but I think you'll find this interesting. This is pretty much the state of the art of how much we understand the acoustic basis, the information that people use when they echolocate. So when you tried this in your home, when Serena had you try this in discussion section, here's the sort of information your brain was using, okay, to determine where you were relative to the wall. And I should mention that these are the sort of things that are available to stationary and moving listeners. Although you'll get a sense that the movement will actually help. But these type of cues are in principle available to whether you're moving or stationary. And I'll show you what I mean. So, imagine now, let's see here. Here, we'll do it this way. Can this work? Yeah. Here's me, here's my wall, okay? I'm clicking, or let's say I'll make a noise like this. Okay, that's a good noise. You'll see why that's a good noise. It's kind of a very, what we call a spectrally complex noise, and a click is too, by the way, but that's a good noise to make. If you're ever on a game show and they say, okay, echolocate, that's a good noise to choose if you're not comfortable clicking. Okay, so what happens when I go like that? All right, the sound will leave my mouth and hit the surface and then come back to me. Bam, like this. Of course, I'm slowing it way down. But look what happens as I get closer to it. Okay, moving closer. Okay, it has a smaller distance to travel to come back to me if it's closer to me than if it's further away. In other words, the further the distance, the longer it takes for the sound to return to my ears. Okay, the longer the time delay between when I make the sound and the sound returns to my auditory brain. Okay. I'm closer, it comes back faster. I'm further, it comes back slower. And we know that for both humans and certainly for bats and other animals that have been studied more for echolocation purposes, that is an important type of information that's used for echolocation. This time delay between the emitted sound and the reflected sound, okay? And you know, you have the idea here that the further something is away from you, the longer it's going to take for the sound to return, okay? Your brain is doing these calculations without your awareness. You cannot introspect and have any kind of a conscious experience that, oh, the sound's returning faster when it's like this than this. Okay? You can't be conscious of that because it's coming back way too fast, but your brain is able to make use of that fact. And clearly, as you get closer, okay, your brain's saying, oh, the sound's coming back faster, therefore I must be closer. I probably should think about stopping soon. I'm back here, okay, Okay, I'm still pretty far away, but uh-oh, here comes the sound. It's coming back faster than it did before. I probably have to stop soon, which is great. I mean, that's something that bats use, it's something that dolphins use, and this is, you know, this has been done in many, many laboratories for those animals. It's also been done for people. Less often, though. It's a less studied phenomenon for humans. But what we do know from our study with humans and how the human brain can use this sound is that type of time delay cue is good if you're pretty far away from, say, the wall you're walking to. Okay, so you're walking to this wall down a hallway, and say you're 20 feet away as you're coming towards it. Your brain can decipher differences in when the time is returning, differences in that time delay of the reflected sound. But when you're close, when you're within, say, 2 meters, okay, so what is that? That's still about, wow, that's pretty far still. Trying to think if I have something here that I can move that you would still be able to see. Probably not. But you have a sense of what 2 meters is, right? It's like, what is it, 6 feet, 5 feet, something like that. Once you're within a 5-foot distance to the wall, right? At that point, yes, there are differences as you get closer in terms of how quickly the delay comes back, how quickly the sound comes back to you. But we know from how your auditory brain works that you can't really decipher those differences. Your brain can't tell whether a sound is returning from a wall that's 4 feet away or 3 feet away. At that point, it's coming back so quickly that your brain can't do it. So this time delay is a useful sort of cue when you're more than 2 meters away from the wall. Okay? But once you're within 2 meters of the wall, it can't use that cue anymore. Your brain just doesn't have the resolving power to be able to time the returning sound well enough to know that. So it's not going to work when you're that close. It's not going to work when you're that close. Let's look at some other cues and see if there are other cues that might work when they're that close. Okay? So here's another cue that we know that bats use, that we know that dolphins use, and we have a sense people use too. When I make a sound, okay, not only is the distance going to determine how quickly the sound comes back to me, but the distance is going to determine how loud it comes back to me. Okay, the intensity of the sound when it comes back to me. Why is that? Well, the longer the distance a sound has to go, the quieter it is. You know this intuitively, right? If you're standing if you're at Coachella and you're standing way away from the stage and the speakers, then the band's going to sound quieter than if you're right there in front of the speakers, right? That's obvious. And that's because, the sound energy kind of disperses over space, over distance, and the farther you are away from a sound, the quieter it is. That's also going to be relevant for echolocation. Okay, I make a sound, okay, my sound leaves my mouth, and because it has to go a further distance there and back, the returning sound will be quieter than if the surface, the reflecting surface, is closer to me. The idea that the intensity will decrease, the returning sound intensity will decrease the further the reflecting surface is away from me. That's all that really means. So that's what I mean by this phrase right here, intensity ratio of the emitted to reflected sound. So if your brain wants to say, measure how loud the sound you're making is versus how loud the sound returning is, okay, it will notice that there's the ratio is greater. There's more emitted sound relative to the reflected sound the further out the surface is. Okay, so as you're getting closer to a surface, the brain's saying, okay, this is the loudness, the intensity of the emitted sound, and here's the intensity of the reflected sound. Okay, it's quieter. That quietness is actually going to change as you get closer to the reflecting surface, okay? So by kind of measuring how loud the outgoing sound is and how loud the returning sound is, your brain can make estimates about where the surface is that you're moving towards. So that's good, and we know that other animals use this, bats, dolphins, We believe that people use it as much as it's been studied in people, okay? But we also know something about what the brain's limitations are when it comes to this sort of thing. And it's the same issue that we just saw. That this will work great as long as you're, say, above 2 meters or beyond 2 meters from the surface. But once you get close, guess what? Your brain really can't hear differences in how loud the returning sound is within 2 meters. Okay, at this point, it can't. The brain just the sound analyzing abilities of the brain just can't tell whether you're within 1 meter or 2 meters away, 4 feet, 6 feet, or whatever, because it's just coming back at too similar a loudness as it's coming back. So time delay and intensity ratio, okay, are both the sort of cues that can be used by the human brain as long as you're, say, beyond 2 meters of the wall you're coming towards. So how are we able to do this? Because you know that, if you tried this out in your home, from the experiments I've discussed, when you're within 2 meters, that's when you really need to be able to slow down, right? So you can walk to the wall and then, with your blindfold on, but in order to perform the task successfully, you've got to be able to, get within the 2 meters of the wall and get close so you're stopping right in front, say at 6 inches or a foot in front, okay? So there has to be some information that your brain is able to use when you're closer than 2 meters from the wall. And there is, fortunately. And it's got a silly name, but it's a name you got to remember. It's called ripple noise pitch. Oh, I hate this name, but it's in the literature, it's in my book, so I'm going to have to teach it to you. Ripple noise pitch. And let me tell you what it's about, ripple noise pitch. Here's what I want you to do, and please try this at home. I can't see you, which is perfectly fine, but I'm going to trust that you're going to do it at home. What I'd like you to do is just take your hand and put it out in front of you like this, and make a sound, make a shushing sound like this. Shh. And then slowly, as you're making this sound, bring your hand close to your lips and see if you can hear the sound change as you move your hand closer. Shh. Maybe you can hear me when I do it. Hopefully my mic can even pick it up. Shh. Okay, now try it. Go closer and further away as you make the sound. Here, I'll do it with 2 hands. Shh. Can you hear a sound change? I can hear it pretty well when I'm doing it. Hopefully you're able to hear it either as my mic picks it up for me or most likely you'll be able to hear it if you're doing it at home yourself. Okay, what's going on there? What's going on there is your emitted sound is interfering with the reflected sound. Okay, your emitted sound is interfering with the reflected sound. Let's go ahead and write that down. Oh, shoot. Yeah, okay, well, you can see all that stuff. I didn't mean it for it all to come up at the same time, but the interference, the sound you're hearing is a change in the emitted sound being interfered with the reflecting sound. And the way to think of this is as follows. That's why I have this little image of waves on the side. So waves are waves, whether they're waves of sound or waves in some sort of body of water. Waves will behave more or less the same way. So I like to think about this as the bathtub illustration of how this kind of ripple noise pitch phenomenon works. Here's what I'd like you to imagine. So I know many of you enjoy taking baths. We got to occupy our time now that we're on quarantine, so maybe you've been taking more baths. I know my kids actually are for some reason. They're teenagers, but they now have been taking baths just to kind of, relax and help them, settle themselves a little bit. But when I take a bath, what I like to do is I like to take my rubber ducky, which I assume you have too, after I fill up the bathtub, and plop him in the middle of the tub. So here I go. I take my rubber ducky, the bathtub's full, I plop him into the middle of the tub, and what I enjoy, of course, I'm sure you do too, is watching him go for a little rubber ducky ride, okay, bouncing up and down on the water. Why is that happening? Why is he bouncing up and down in the water? Well, he's bouncing up and down because he's made waves when I dropped him into the water, right? So I drop him into the water, where he hit the water, the waves are kind of emitting from where he's made contact to the water, and the waves are going to the side of the bathtub. Okay. Now those waves are bouncing off the side of the bathtub and coming back to him, and he is now getting a little rubber ducky ride because of the waves that he's created in the bathtub himself. And he's always smiling, so I know it's fun for him, right? Well, here's something that's cool that happens though. As he comes back, as the waves come back, they kind of push him out of the water a little bit, and that creates another wave. So he's bouncing up and down, and he's continually making emitted waves that are leaving where he's contacting the water, which are then interfering with returning waves that are coming from the bathtub sides. And that's exactly what you're seeing here, okay? You're seeing emitted waves. I think this would be a little, imagine this is where the rubber ducky is. Looks like there's a little post that's creating, some sort of waves, and the waves are emitting off of the rubber ducky, hitting the wall of the bathtub. The bathtub wall is reflecting the waves and coming back, and that continually happens so that there is an interference between the emitted waves and reflected waves, okay? That little rubber ducky demonstration is pretty much telling you what's going on with this cue for echolocation. Okay? Obviously, it's happening in different time scales and a different medium, right? It's happening a lot faster when we're doing the demonstration like this. It's also in air and not water, but it's the same exact idea. Okay, my mouth is the rubber ducky. This is the bathtub. Okay, and it's leaving. My sound is leaving the rubber ducky mouth, hitting the bathtub wall, and coming back to me. And as I continue to make sound, my emitted waves are being interfered with by the reflected waves. That interference pattern is going to change as my distance from the surface changes, as it gets smaller. So what you're hearing there is a change in the emitted and reflected waves interfering with each other. It's a change. And it is something we know that is available for the brain to analyze when we are within 2 meters from the wall, 2 meters from the surface that we're echolocating. So what likely happens here is you're walking to the wall, you're clicking, you're making your sound or whatever, and as long as you're beyond 2 meters from the wall, your brain is using time delay and the ratio of emitted versus reflected sound, okay? But then once you get about 2 meters away, your brain shifts to use another sound cue. In this case, it's this ripple, noise, pitch sound cue, okay? So it's kind of a shift from one set of cues to another, okay? Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about that before we leave. First of all, this silly name, ripple, noise, pitch. Well, ripple, you understand, right? Ripple, it has to do with the interference between outgoing waves and returning waves. That's okay. Noise, it's kind of nicely illustrated by noise of sound that's interfering with each other. And the pitch, well, it kind of sounds like the pitch is changing. It's not really the pitch, okay? Don't worry about it. But that's just to give you a sense. But just know that ripple, noise, pitch cue is the cue your brain uses when you're within 2 meters of the wall, and it has to do with interference patterns. Okay, there you go. There's the name. Anyway, you can see I get kind of frustrated that that's still what it's called because it doesn't really describe it well. Anyway, here's what I think is really interesting, though. I've always thought this was really interesting. You know, if you've tried this, you probably experienced it. As you're walking to the wall, you don't really know how close you are very specifically until you're pretty close. And all of a sudden, when you're pretty close, for me at least, that's when this experience of something big in front of me starts occurring. That's when I feel kind of like this imposing object that's kind of making my skin feel tight, or is kind of causing my skin muscles, the muscles behind my skin, to kind of tighten a little bit. That is basically, I think, where this facial vision experience starts becoming real. In other words, well, real, I mean that when you're coming to the wall, all of a sudden this facial vision thing happens when you're within 2 meters. So I think this is now fairly well established that when you're shifting, when you're switching from the time delay and the intensity ratio cues to the ripple noise pitch cue, these interference cues, that's when all of a sudden you say, whoa, there's something in front of me. So your experience of something coming, that something big is right in front of you, is possibly based on that shift from one set of cues to another set of cues. Your brain's saying, whoa, okay, I'm using ripple noise pitch now. I'm going to tell my brain's owner, that means something's very close, which is kind of cool. Okay. I said we can't really experience these sound changes. This is kind of an exaggeration of it, of course, but for the most part, when you're echolocating, you can't experience these sound changes. But the way the sounds change do influence what you think is in front of you and how large it is. Okay, very cool. Let's take a little break here and see if there's any questions, and then do a polling question. And hopefully we'll see what we learned. Okay, Chase asks a question: was there a difference in how well they echolocated between those who had been blind from birth and those who lost their sight at some point? So you're asking about accuracy with echolocation for the blind. And yes, what you generally find is that people who are blind at a very early age or blind from birth are generally better at echolocating than those who lost their vision later. There are certainly exceptions, though. Brian Bushway, I believe, did not lose his sight until he was a teenager, if not a little bit older, although I don't know what his vision was like early on. But people do learn to echolocate with some accuracy. Brian can bike ride. With losing their vision later on. But for the most part, in terms of how this has been studied in the laboratory, yes, researchers have found that people who are born blind do have better echolocation skills for the most part. Now, it's an open question whether that has just to do with more experience, more, all childhood, or whether that their brains are somewhat different. There is some idea that, somebody who's born with a sensory loss does kind of have a different kind of type of plasticity, maybe a more extreme type of plasticity than someone who lost their sense later on in life. Okay, but yes, there is a difference. It's a very good question, Chase. Other questions about Daniel Kish or echolocation or something like that? Be happy to answer anything at all. No, we're okay. Any questions at all about how this is done or anything? Okay, you'll probably have some more later on. That's okay. Let's do a poll then. All right. So, this one's so easy. We just learned this, but it's good. It's nothing else. It will give you a good practice to how questions are asked. Yeah, you'll ace this. Okay, so the question is this. Echolocation can determine, so which of the following, here's the question, which of the following can be determined through echolocation? Object size, object distance, object texture, or all of the above? Everyone's going to get this, but I'll go ahead and have you do it anyway. Okay, there's a question that will be on your midterm. Which of the following can be determined through echolocation? You should have no problem with this. Good. Okay, let's see, there's 15 students today. 13 have answered so far. I'm wondering if some people are just recording it and not actually watching. That's okay if they want to do that. As you know, the recording it was posted on YouTube, so you don't need to record it yourself, but you're certainly welcome to. Okay, I guess the 13 that responded are done, so we will stop there, and I will share the results. Most of you did get this right. The answer is all of the above. As I just mentioned about half an hour ago, blind and sighted people can learn to not just echolocate, say, a wall or an object's distance. They can also make judgments on the object's size, as I said, and the object's texture. Okay, the object size and texture are things they can echolocate as well. And you know something? I realized here, it does not say size on the slide. I wonder if that confused people. Oh, shoot, I hope not. I said size, and I said to add it to the slide, but I should put size in there. Maybe I will change that so people have a slide that says size in it. Every once in a while, there will be little mistakes. Trust what I say, not what the slide says. I'm smarter than the slides. Okay, so size is something they can judge. They can judge the size, remember, of a triangle, square, or disc. The correct answer is all of the above. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Ralph has one. Would you think that someone who is born deaf would have the brain adapt and enhance the hearing, therefore have an easier time to use echolocation? I'm not exactly sure how somebody who is born deaf would be able to echolocate. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, Ralph. Someone who was born deaf, maybe meant blind, have the brain adapt, enhance the hearing, therefore, maybe you mean blind, maybe, yeah. So I do think somebody who is born blind, yeah, so you mean, yeah, so he said I was typing fast, that's no problem, it's a casual class. Yes, I do think that someone who is born blind, and we'll talk about this later on in some detail about what happens with sensory loss at different stages through a person's life. But yes, in general, I think people who are born with a sensory loss are thought to do more compensation, both in terms of their perceptual skill, their behavior, and in terms of how the brain is shifting around. Yeah, so I think you will find that that's generally the case. But again, you know, I can think of, you know, Dan Kish can tell you, yeah, you know, I do find people are better if they've been born blind, but yeah, I have a lot of friends that didn't go blind until they were later, and you know, with lots of effort, they learn to do these sorts of things too. So yeah, it's cool. Any other questions about this? Thank you for asking, Ralph. Great. Okay, let's go back to our slides then. Okay. Let's talk about Daniel and his friends that can expertly echolocate. And actually, what I'm going to be talking about are experiments that actually involved Dan himself in the subject pool. Okay, these are experiments that were actually conducted with Daniel, and I think in some cases Brian Bushway on this. And I know the researchers, they actually conducted this research in Belgium, and they flew out Daniel and Brian, who live down here right in Orange County, so they could be subjects in this along with other folks. And so you're going to be pretty impressed with what they can do. There is Daniel. So what I've written there is the expert's accuracy is comparable to visual resolution of the sighted. And let me first explain how these experiments were conducted, and then I'll go ahead and unpack that statement on the slide. So what you want to look at here is this image right here. This is taken right from the research publication. And part of what they did with Daniel and his expert friends is they had them echolocate discs that were positioned one above the other. And their job was to say whether the top one was to the left or right of the bottom one. So you can see this would be, say, Daniel's little head right here, and he's facing this frame that has the disc on top or bottom. So you have to kind of put yourself, you have to kind of, imagine yourself in Daniel's position. And the correct answer here would be the left disk is, the top disk is left of the bottom disk, correct? You understand that? The top disk is left of the bottom disk. Right? And then there'd be another trial where these were kind of shifted in the opposite direction, and they say, okay, echolocate and tell us where these disks are, and you say, oh, this time the top disk is to the right of the bottom disk. So it's a very easy sort of choice to make if you're an echolocator, but what's impressive is what they were able to test is how fine his resolution would be. So looking at this particular example you can see in the slide here, you can see that the object on top, is this working? Let's see, yeah. Yeah, the object on top is pretty, for me now, is pretty much to the left of the object on bottom. But they're able to move the position so there's very little difference in whether the one on top is to the left or right of the one on the bottom. So they can almost be exactly on top of each other and then shift it over just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit and have them echolocate, okay? So do I have some things here that I can use? Yeah, maybe these will work. Stay right there. Look, it's magic foam balls. Okay, so these are right on top of each other, okay? And what you're seeing there in that slide, in that image, is the left object more to the, the top object fairly far over to the left relative to the bottom object. But they can move these, the experimenters can move these all around and find out what the resolution is that Daniel and his friends have when it comes to making these judgments. And what they find is that they can almost be on top of each other with a tiny, tiny little shift, and Daniel would still be able to tell whether the one on top was to the left or the right. And that difference that was needed was so small, okay, that it was comparable to what you and I could do looking at these images, looking at these disks, okay? So right now, can you tell the one on top is just a tiny bit over, from my perspective, just a tiny bit over from the left relative to the one on bottom? Am I doing this okay? Can you guys see this? Yeah, good, okay. See, there's very little difference. And maybe you'd sometimes be wrong in saying, nope, they're right on top of each other. They're exactly on top of each other. But you might be able to do it if it's just a tiny, tiny little bit more to the left, okay, from my perspective again. And my image might be reversed, I don't know. Anyway, you get the idea that his ability to determine its position relative to another object's position was as good as if you and I were judging these by looking at it, which is really amazing. I mean, he's able to judge the horizontal position of objects almost as accurately, or as accurately, I guess, in this experiment, as if you and I were just looking at the objects, not echolocating at all, which is really, really interesting. Okay, next point. Oh, by the way, just so you know this, this is just degrees, 1.2 degrees, and you don't have to worry about this. You'd never be asked this specific number or anything like that. But I'm just trying to, degrees is, this is 180 degrees is, kind of the scope that we can see in. So, 1 degree would be about here, and he can tell whether things are shifted that much. That's all that means. Don't worry about, that number. Just know that what's important from this point is his resolution at determining the horizontal location of an object through echolocation is as good as yours if you were making a judgment looking at these objects. Okay, good. You got the idea. Now, you asked about experts and onset. And yes, again, there is a correlation between how good people are at echolocating and how early they lost their sight. And if they did lose their sight at birth functionally, like Daniel did, then absolutely, you do find that those folks are better for the most part, okay? But again, it's important to realize that, that's the overall, I guess, trends of performance with late onset people and early onset people. You do find folks like Brian Bushray, who is really impressive, is, I think, probably as impressive as Daniel Kish when it comes to making some of these judgments, who lost his sight later on. So this kind of brain flexibility for purposes of sensory compensation works for folks that have lost their sight later, as well as earlier. However, for the most part, the earlier one loses their sight, the better they would be at echolocation for the most part. The next point, though, I think you're going to find really interesting, and it is related to this idea, because what happens in the blind brain when it comes to things like echolocation? So I've been talking about just generally the type of sound the brain is using for the purposes of echolocation, but what part of the brain is doing that? And we know more about that when it comes to these experts. They did brain imaging with Daniel and Brian and all his echolocation expert friends, and they found something very interesting. When they are listening to sound for the purposes of doing echolocation, the parts of their brain that would usually be most involved in vision are being used. Okay, so as I said, the brain's actually much more flexible than we used to think, but we can say that the part back here is really good with visual input. Of course, if you're blind, you're not getting visual input. So what does it do? It rededicates itself to other sorts of sensory activities. As you'll learn, it does a lot of good stuff for touch. It helps a blind person's sense of touch to involve their visual brain areas. And here's an example where it helps their sense of sound. When a blind individual echolocates, they are using the parts of their brain that would normally be most active for vision. Okay, so it's back here. And it suggests that the visual brain doesn't have anything to do because there's no visual input, so it wants to help touch. And in this case, it wants to help sound. It wants to help the auditory brain be able to determine where things are in the world. And it is used for echolocation in that sense. And it's interesting because, they set up the experiment in a way where the sounds that Daniel was listening to during the imaging were either for purposes of echolocation, so that Daniel would hear the sounds and they say, imagine how far is this thing in front of you as you're listening to these sounds, these click sounds. And so there was, this kind of reflected part of the signal that he was hearing as well. And he'd say, I guess maybe 3-4 feet, something like that. And as he was doing that, his visual brain area was active. Versus another condition where they would play clicks, but the clicks were not really recorded in any space, and he wasn't asked to echolocate. He was just asked something like, how many clicks did you just hear? 1, 2, or 3? You say 2, okay? And when he did that, that part of the brain, the visual part of the brain, was not activated. Instead, it was just his auditory brain area, the part over on this side of his head, okay, that was being used. In other words, it's not like his visual brain is being activated for every sound he's hearing. That's not true. It's only for sounds like echolocation, where he's got to make a judgment about space, a judgment about where things are. When he's judging, the location of something through clicks, he's going to be using his visual brain areas. When he's just listening to the same type of clicks now, but is judging the number of clicks and there's no reflected part of the signal involved, he's just using his auditory brain like the rest of us would use. So it seems like it's something that's dependent on the task and the richness of the information when he's involving his visual brain areas. And interestingly, oh yeah, this is cool. All right, let's take a second and make sure we understand this. This is a little bit complicated, but I think you're going to find this interesting. This is an old phenomenon known as the size-weight illusion. Oh, and I should have gotten some nice examples here of, shoot, do I have examples here where I can use this? I think maybe we'll just have to imagine it. I'm just trying to, I got to, All right, no, never mind. Okay, so imagine this. All right, you're holding holding a box. Okay, you're holding a box, and the box is the same weight, whether it is small, okay, or large. Okay, so this is a big box, so you can put it in your hand still. Say it's, I don't know, I guess maybe about this big, so you can hold it in your hand, versus a small box, which you're also able to hold your hand, but these weigh the same things. Okay, in other words, I just put these on a scale, and they are exactly the same weight. Which do you think, though, you would experience as heavier? Would it be the small box that has that weight, or the large box that has that weight? And if you can kind of envision what this would be like, shoot, here's a box. Okay, here's a box. Okay, this has the same weight as, imagine now, a very, very small box that's maybe this big that has the same weight as this. Which one would seem heavier to me? And hopefully, if you're able to imagine this, that you would realize that the small box would actually feel heavier even though they're the same weight. This is the size-weight illusion. Okay, smaller things that are the same weight as larger things feel heavier even though they're the same weight. Does that make sense to you? They kind of feel denser, right? Oh, this thing does feel heavier than this thing, even though they're actually the same weight, because it feels denser. Does that make sense? I hope that's clear. I'm sorry if I made that a little bit more confusing than it needed to be. But small things that are the same weight as large things feel heavier. Okay? This is the sideways weight illusion. It's something we all have. Now, what I want to mention about echolocation is that Daniel Kish also would experience the size-weight illusion even though he can't see how big these things are. What he can do, though, is echolocate these things. And what they did is something really kind of cool. Hold on just a second. They placed small boxes and big boxes in front of him and asked him to echolocate them. Say, okay, there's a small one, there's a medium one, there's a big one. Okay, I know which one is which. And now then they asked him to lift each box with a pulley system. The pulley system allowed him to determine the weight of the box, or to judge the weight of the box without actually touching it. So the only thing he's able to determine the size of the box through is echolocation. Okay? And so then after he echolocates and says, this is a small box, this is the large box, he says, okay, now we're going to ask you to lift the small box, okay, with a pulley. Okay? Now lift the large box with a pulley. Which one seems heavier? And what they found is that to him, even though they were actually the same weight, because he had just echolocated the size, the small one, again, like us, seemed heavier than the large one, even though they were the same weight. In other words, he experiences the same size-weight illusion that we do by looking at the box through echolocating the boxes. It works in the same way, which suggests that when he's judging the size of something through echolocation, it's having as much of a bearing on how his other senses are working as when we're looking at things. So this echolocation information for something like size goes deep into the nervous system and has an effect on how heavy something is felt by him. And so that's what I mean by echolocating the size induces the same size-weight illusion that you and I have when we look at things. Okay, great. All right, let's continue here and talk about the importance of the sound that is being used. All right, I think you'll find this very interesting. So everything I've talked about so far, whether it was with Daniel Kish or whether it was yourself in these kind of demonstrations, were examples where you were making some type of sound and then waiting kind of for that sound to return to you. Again, your brain's doing this. You're not conscious of doing this, of course. You're making the sound, but you can't hear the difference in sound, right? But as it turns out, you don't need to use your own sound to echolocate. right? That's how I've been describing it, is like how bats do it. And typically bats are studied by understanding how their own reflected sound comes back to them. Same with dolphins and whales, how their own reflected sound comes back to them. It's how I've been discussing it. But we now know that you don't need to use your own sound to echolocate. In fact, these early experiments that I was discussing, where people are going into these old buildings on Cornell in the 1950s and performing echolocation, actually were sometimes done in situations where the subject themselves didn't make the sound. Okay, so we discussed how these hard-soled shoes can create kind of this great sound for echolocating. So that's a case, I guess, where the performer is actually making the sound themselves, or they're clicking like Daniel Kish, or they're saying testing or something like that. But many of these early echolocations experiments involved creating a sound that was either attached via a loudspeaker to the subject. So, they kind of tied a little, what a loudspeaker looks like, onto the subject's chest, and had like a little synthetic sound go through, maybe a sound back then, it must have been made by some sort of wave generator or some sort of early synthesizer. So it probably went beep, beep, something like that. Or sometimes what they did is they took loudspeakers and suspended them above the subject. As the subject was walking, that loudspeaker would follow them, and it was also making a beep. And what they found was that people were still able to echolocate, using a sound that they were actually not making. So just to get this in, the sounds in these old experiments were sometimes clicks, sometimes tones, the beep beep sounds, sometimes white noise, which is just a which is a really good sound for echolocating. These subjects back in these old experiments didn't need to be making their own sound in order to perform the task, which is interesting. It's going to prove to be a kind of a profound point for what we'll be talking about over the rest of the class for the most part, which is that you're probably echolocating all the time, even though you're not the one making the sound. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. But to understand that, what I'd like to talk about is what happens when you listen to a seashell. That's why that seashell is there right there. So you've done this sort of thing before. Here, let me get a good seashell. Look at, hey, I almost picked up this example and poured it into my ear so I could demonstrate it for you, but I caught myself in time, and instead I'm going to find something else that's going to make a good seashell here. Here, I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Yes. Yes. Good. Here we go. A beer can, which I just happen to have here. Right? It's actually part of a magic trick I'm going to do for you later, but we'll use this as our seashell now. You probably know something about seashells, that when you put them to your ear, you hear the ocean, right? You've done this when you were a kid. I think that's something that a lot of parents have their little kids do. Say, hey, look, want to hear something cool? You pick up a seashell, you listen to it, and you can hear like the oceans inside. And it really kind of does sound like the ocean. If you haven't done this before, it's something that's fun to try, but you can actually try it a little bit now if you wanted to. Take your hand like this and put it next to your ear. Okay, take your hands, cup them, make a nice little bowl there with your hands, and put them next to your ear, and listen. Just very, very quiet sound. You can probably hear a whooshing sound when you do that. You can actually, what you can do if you want is you can actually kind of simulate a beach sound by putting your little hand bowl over your ear and then slowly moving one of your hands back and forth. Sounds like the surf kind of rushing onto the beach. Yeah, if you're doing this, do you start imagining the smell of seawater and hearing gulls in the background? Okay. It's a nice way to relax, actually. It's not bad. What's going on? That is not a recording of the ocean in there, clearly. What's happening is that seashell, that hand bowl, that beer can, is actually amplifying something that is occurring in the room you're in all the time. It's called ambient sound. And what ambient sound is just the kind of quiet sounds that are inside a room. So I'm in my room right now. Well, I'm actually skiing, as you know, but there are sounds in the real room I'm recording in, my garage, that come from, the vents that are in this room. Maybe, my computer's making a little bit of a sound as it's being as it's cooling itself down, and maybe the same thing's happening in your room. Is there conditioning on? Is there a fan on? Maybe you're just hearing the sounds outside, quiet sounds outside, the wind that's outside that's coming through the window. In all those cases, those would be quiet ambient sounds that are actually kind of filling the room, even though they're not very noticeable. And what a seashell does, kind of, I guess, in a kind of fun, romantic way, is it actually amplifies those ambient sounds that are in your room in such a way that it ends up sounding like the ocean a little bit. So here's my old beer can. And as I listen to this and maybe move it back and forth, yeah. This is a good thing to take a snapshot of. I'm hearing this ocean type sound. It just so happens that a small little cavity like this, like the beer can, like a seashell, does amplify the sorts of ambient sounds of the room, so it ends up sounding a little bit like the ocean. Okay, why am I telling you that? I'm telling you this because, as it turns out, you can actually use that type of sound to do some echolocation. Now, what do I mean here by echolocation? It's going to be a different concept a little bit in this case, isn't it? It's going to be a little bit of a different concept because I'm not making a sound here. I'm using these quiet sounds in the room, right? And I'm going to be able to use these quiet sounds to some degree in order to determine something about the room itself. And in the 1980s, some researchers who were interested in echolocation did some research with ambient sounds where they asked, I think for the most part, these were children, blind children, to be very quiet. Okay, they did this one at a time. They had the blind children who were blind from birth, for those of you that are interested. They asked them to take off their shoes, okay, just walk around in their socks and not make any sound at all. They made sure they weren't wearing noisy clothing or anything like that, and try just to determine where things were in front of them. Okay, they're not making any sound. It's not like those old experiments with the hard-soled shoes on the wooden floors. These are very, very, very quiet environments. But in doing this, they found that blind children could do things like determine the presence of a sound reflecting wooden panel that was placed in front of them. 4 feet wide, that's what this is. This is the presence of a 4-foot wide panel that was placed in front of them. Okay. Again, there's no sound that they're making. There's no major sound being made in the room. It's just the ambient sound of the room. They're also able to determine the location of little cardboard strips that are about 6 inches, okay, so that they're able to walk between them. Again, not making a sound themselves, but just based on how those strips kind of reflected the ambient sounds of the room, those really, really quiet sounds in the room. They were able to do other things. Okay, they were able to determine when they were coming to an intersection in a corridor. So, as they were moving down a hallway, how do they learn how do they know when they were at an intersection where there was another hallway, meeting the hallway they were in? And they were able to do that as well, again using sound. And they do all the right tests. They place headphones on the kids and all that sort of stuff, and it works really, really, really well. Now, I should mention one other thing they can do is they can actually perform the skill show that they can perform the skill by walking along a wall that's in the corridor. So, you can imagine you ask somebody to walk down the corridor. If they're not making sound themselves, right? If they're not making the sound themselves, it's going to be tough. But if they're asked to kind of walk next to a wall, they can do that again, based on how the wall is reflecting the quiet sounds of the hallway. You can imagine the sounds in a hallway, right? There's nobody else around. The building's been closed down, so they could do these experiments. The sounds in those hallways would probably be the ventilation again. So, you know, the very, very sorts of quiet sounds that are in your room right now that maybe you didn't notice until you did this. The purpose of this, by the way, is just for you to notice that there are ambient sounds in your room. But even without amplifying it like that, it looks like blind children, at least, can perform these sorts of tasks. They can, you know, stop before they get to a 4-foot panel. They can determine where 6-inch cardboard strips are by moving between them. They can determine where the intersection of a corridor is, and they can walk along a wall without hitting it and make sure it's a straight line, again, based on how ambient sounds are structured by these things. So what I'm arguing here is this notion of how we first introduced echolocation and how we discussed it with bats and dolphins as a kind of sonar system, the idea that you send out a signal, the signal comes back changed or delayed or quieter or interfering. There are limitations to that because we don't need to be making our own sound in order for the brain to use sound reflections to guide our behavior. Okay? At least for these blind kids, that seems to have been established. We don't need to do that. Now, there are some advantages to making your own sound, and Daniel Kish will say this. You know, Daniel Kish knows this literature very well. He thinks it's really, really interesting. But he will say, yeah, I know that, you know, especially, you know, I can use these kind of ambient sounds to, if there's enough of it, to kind of guide my behavior. I don't need to click in certain situations, he said, but if I'm bike riding and I'm hiking, I want to be able to make the sound myself because it really helps me be more accurate about where things are very quickly. So what I like to think about here is the idea of a splunker. Now that's a weird term, spelunker. There's some splunkers there. There's Harrison Ford and, oh, what's his name again? The kind of weird, troubled, but pretty talented actor. I can't remember his name. I'm sure you recognize him. It's in the last Indiana Jones movie they made. And I just wanted to show people in a cave because that's what a spelunker is. That's the name, technical term. Splunker is somebody who investigates or you know, explores caves. That's what a splunker is. Not a critical term for you to know, but I think it's a fun thing to say. Spelunker. You go down and you're there with Harrison Ford and you got a flashlight and Harrison Ford has a flashlight, okay? And you're in the cave here. I guess it's Indiana Jones, right? You're in the cave with Indiana Jones and you don't know what's in there. And you turn your flashlight on and say, oh my gosh, look at all these things in there. It looks like it's an alien head and there's some rats and there's some snakes and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, your flashlight starts running out of power. Doesn't work anymore. And Indiana Jones says, okay, I'll turn on my flashlight. And he turns on his flashlight and he's able to determine, along with you, that there's other things in there too, that there's an old amulet and a boulder that's rolling towards you and all those great things that Indiana Jones has, right? And what's going on here is that you're able to use the reflected light from his flashlight in order to determine where things are, okay? You're able to determine something about what's in the room, not from the reflections of your flashlight, but the reflections of his flashlight. And that's an important fact because it shows that you don't need to use your own signal. You can use his signal to determine where things are. Certainly you're better if you have your own flashlight. You'll more quickly be able to tell where things are and maybe to determine where more things are, right? But the fact that you can use his reflected information is a nice kind of metaphor for what I think is going on when we use reflected sound. Yes, it does help Daniel Kish to make his own clicks, to hear the reflections of his own emitted sounds. It probably helps if you can, you know, use your own footsteps as you're echolocating or making your own ch-ch or testing sound. But you don't need to use it for everything. And in fact, this is the idea, that your brain is not only able to determine where things are by your own sounds. It's also able to determine where things are by the normal ambient sounds of a room, which is going to be a very important concept for us to understand how sound engineers have to make use of different sorts of techniques to fool your brain into thinking that you're in the same room as you're watching in a movie or TV show. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but why don't we stop here and ask another question, another polling question, and see if you have any comments or questions, and then we'll take our little break. Okay, Shia LaBeouf, that's right. Okay, thank you, Brittany. I appreciate that. I couldn't remember his name. I just saw him in a movie that I thought, geez, he's a really talented actor, even though he's kind of an odd and troubled guy. But yeah, that's his name, Shia LaBeouf, if I'm pronouncing it right. Any questions about anything we've talked about since our last break? Anything to do with echolocation and expert echolocators and how they use their visual brains for purposes of echolocation, or anything to do with the sort of ambient sound I'm talking about most recently? Anything? Okay, then let's do a polling question and then we'll take our break. All right. So, hold on a sec. Is this new? Yes. Here we go. This is a good question. The question is this. When an echolocator is less than 2 meters from a sound reflecting surface, less than 2 meters, which type of acoustic cue is he/she probably using most? Is it the time delay between emitted and reflected sound, the intensity ratio between emitted and reflected sound, or ripple noise pitch, or is it both A and B? So when somebody is within 2 meters, closer than 2 meters, which sound cue are they using? And let's see how you do on this one. Yep, people are doing well. Not too hard. Okay. Looks like how many people have answered? 10, 11, 12. See if anyone wants to. Do they allow you to change your answer? If somebody could just say yes or no. Are you allowed to change your answer in these polls just out of curiosity? No. Oh my gosh. Do you wish you could, Ralph? Were you No. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. Well, again, there's nothing to worry about if you get it wrong. I have no idea. You know, it's completely anonymous. It has no bearing. This is just for you to get the questions, to get used to the questions I'm asking, and to get the actual questions for your midterm. Okay. Let's share the results. The correct answer is in fact C. So most of you did get this. A few people did choose one, A and B, and D as well. And let's spend a couple of seconds on this before we take our break. So when you're within 2 meters, your brain can't resolve differences in the reflected sound based on delay or the reflected sound based on the intensity of the emitted and reflected sound. Remember, we talked about your brain doesn't have the resolving power. So it's not A and B. It is, in fact, ripple noise pitch. When you're within 2 meters, it is that interfering sort of sound that we were talking about that has, sadly, that terrible name, but you need to remember it. Ripple noise pitch is the ducky example where we're talking about emerging sound and reflected sound interfering with each other. Now, let me say something about the nature of this type of question. You're going to see a lot of questions that are on the exam and throughout our discussion here where the answer of D is A and B or all of the above and that sort of thing. Sometimes that will be the correct answer, right? Sometimes in order for me to, kind of test all the possibilities that are related to an issue, I will have the answer correct. All of the above are correct answers. But here is an example where that's not the correct answer. So I know people tend to get a little distracted by that, say, well, if it's A and B, that kind of encapsulates more information, so that might be the correct answer. In this case, it's not. You really have to understand the concepts that I've been presenting in order to answer this correctly. Okay, so the correct answer here is C. Go ahead and take a picture if you want, if you haven't yet. And we will stop here and see if there's any other quick questions from you folks. No? Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and reconvene then at 11:30. Hey everybody, thought I'd introduce you to Max the dog. Here he is. Look, he can wave on his own and everything. He's getting a little distracted by the cats though. This is Max the dog. I think he's probably about 10 now. He's getting a little old, but he still looks like a puppy. He just got a puppy cut. There he is. He's a good boy. There. That's the best you can do. All right, give me a second. I'm going to put him somewhere else, and I'll come back and we'll continue our discussion. Okay. Hopefully you had a nice few-minute break. Oh, people are chatting. I bet they're commenting on Max the dog. Let's take a look. Oh, yeah, people like him. Brittany says he's a baby. William says adorable. Kimberly likes his little wave. Yep, no, he did that on his own. I trained him to do that. I'm a psychologist, so I'm able to train him to do a wave. Just kidding. All right, let's get back to it. There we are. Let me know if those little kitty cats are too distracting there. They sure look cute to me. Okay, so let's continue with our discussion here about ambient acoustics. And I just thought this was really a kind of a fun way to understand the sorts of sounds that we don't usually think of our brains as using. Clearly, remember the big picture here is that we're talking about being able to hear the world that doesn't make sound, but instead structures sound. And we just learned a lot about that through our discussion of echolocation. But now what I'd like to do is understand how this is actually something that affects our daily lives. And I think one of the most fun ways to do this is to meet some sound engineers from the movie and TV field to see how they have to deal with how our brain can use reflected sound. So I like to think of this as taking lessons from Hollywood, hearing lessons from Hollywood. And it's really interesting. When you talk to these folks, I interviewed a whole bunch of people from Hollywood that do sound engineering. And when you talk to these folks, they all talk about the same issue. The issue being that in order for you to be engaged in a movie, or engaged in an episode of a television show you're watching, it's really important that you be kept in the scene. That was a term I kept on hearing over and over again. You want to keep the audience in the scene. And the general idea here is that you want the audience as much as possible to imagine themselves in the same location, the same space as the action they're watching. You know, so if you're watching two people talking in a bedroom, for example, you want the audience to imagine to whatever degree they can that they're in the bedroom with people, and you don't want anything to take them out of that. You don't want them to be distracted and you know, kind of I guess either consciously or unconsciously realize they're watching a movie or watching a TV show. Don't get me wrong; they're not trying to do any, you know, kind of illusion or hypnotism or anything like that, but they want people to be as engaged as possible with the action they're seeing, and therefore they have to do things for the auditory system to help with that. Okay, so the idea is that if you're watching in a movie theater or something like that, or you're watching in your home theater, it's as if the location you're in is an extension of the scene space, and that any glitch that's in the scene film itself, the video itself, or in the sound can take an audience out of that. So in the old days, for example, in movie theaters, when people were first starting to use cell phones regularly, they would forget to turn them off, or they would sometimes actually even take a call during as a movie was being shown. That it really did happen. I know you guys are all really good at this. Most of us now have the default of our phone being silent, right? But in the old days, people didn't do that. Phones would ring all the time in movie theaters, and you'd have people, even if it was just something as simple as like, yeah, I'm in the movie theater, I can't talk right now. People would be distracted left and right. Okay, fortunately, it doesn't happen anymore, but there are other reasons that people can be kind of taken out of the scene. They can be, kind of distracted and not feel as engaged in the movie. So here's an example. This is one of my favorite movies, Plan 9 from Outer Space. Do you know this movie? This is a movie that was done by the director that's considered one of the worst directors ever in the history of Hollywood. His name was Ed Wood. And there's a great movie starring Johnny Depp, directed by, what's his name? The same guy that did Beetlejuice and the earlier Batman films. I can't remember his name now. Tim Burton. He made a movie with Johnny Depp called Ed Wood, and it's a story about the worst director in Hollywood, and it's really wonderful. If you get a chance, see it. But he was known, Ed Wood, for just wanting to portray the story and not caring about how good the quality of the film was. And if you want examples of how glitches can kind of take you out of a movie, go see an old Ed Wood movie like Plan 9 from Outer Space. So here's a scene. You can see they spare no expense for this, right? There's a scene of two pilots in a cockpit. I guess they're going to be encountering aliens soon. But if you look at this, I mean, there's lots of reasons why it doesn't seem realistic, but can you see anything that's a real glitch that would kind of remind you that you're watching a movie and not, a real scene? And in this case, it's so conspicuous, right? I mean, in this case, it's this shadow of the boom microphone. And that's something that a sound engineer also has to be careful of, is to not, either have the image of the microphone or a shadow of the microphone in the scene. But these are just very kind of conspicuous examples. Other conspicuous examples might be things like where the soundtrack doesn't match the scene. Now, these days, they're not as bad as they used to be. But in the old days, a lot of films, especially these older like Godzilla films, they were dubbed so poorly. So they were filmed in Japan, and what they do is they bring them to America, and they would have American actors kind of fill in the dialogue that in English that was originally filmed in Japan, and they would have very little care of how accurately the sound of the lines met up with the visible articulations you were saying. I mean, they would be really, really way off, and they didn't care very much. And you'd be watching it, you try to get as excited about Godzilla as possible, but whenever you see a conspicuously poorly dubbed line, it would be like, oh God, it's like hard to concentrate on the movie. Those are very conspicuous examples. The old Godzilla movies, the old Ed Wood movies are very conspicuous examples where there'd be a glitch and things didn't match up right. But there are a lot of subtle things. Those sort of things don't happen very much anymore. But there are now things that still can happen. And these folks that do sound for movies and TV feel very strongly can actually throw you out of the scene as well. Something else just very quickly. There are sometimes, glitches in continuity and in props and things like this. So maybe if you're I'm not a Game of Thrones fan, but I heard that in one scene there was, supposed to take place in this fantasy land that's much like, medieval Europe or something. And there was a Starbucks coffee cup in a scene. People thought it was so hysterical, but it also is something that's distracting. There's other instances where, if something's supposed to be taking place in a specific city like New York, but it's actually filmed in Toronto, if you see something that is, like a conspicuously Toronto sort of building or something like that, people are taken out of the scene. All those sort of glitches occur, and people are hired to make sure these glitches don't occur. But the sound glitches are what I was most interested in, and I was most interested in talking to people about how they made sure that these glitches, even the most subtle glitches, didn't occur. So here's one lesson that we can learn from Hollywood, that the brain, your brain, my brain, is exquisitely sensitive to how rooms structure sound. So the room you're in right now, the room I'm in now with the little kitties playing behind me, has its own sound. Okay, it has a sound that structures, the sound of my voice as I'm speaking, as well as the sound of the fan that's on in this room, and maybe the fan that's coming out of my computer. A room has a way of structuring sound, and our brains are much more sensitive to that than we would ever have thought. Okay, so here's something that these folks have to worry about a lot in Hollywood, where very often the scene that is being filmed is such that what is being shown on camera does not match what the actual structure, sound structure of the room is like. Let me give you a good example. So it's important then that they make changes so the visible and audible spaces match. Okay. So here's, say, a scene that's being filmed for a show. What show would this be? It looks like it's going to be a bedroom scene. I'm looking at it. Yeah, it looks like a bedroom scene. And they are filming it. Typically they would bring in the cameras and film a lot of close-ups in this bedroom scene, maybe of a couple, discussing their children or something like that. So the scene that's going to be depicted is, very close. It's a small location that's being portrayed in this scene for this, say, TV show. So that's the visible space, where the acoustic space can be completely different and very often is. It can be something like this. Okay, that's in fact exactly what you would see. So this is a sound stage. And in Hollywood, I think this is from Paramount. Here you can see that the space that the scene is going to be filmed in is very small. So it's going to show you a lot of close-ups and a lot of close walls and the bed and all that sort of stuff. But the acoustic space, and you can imagine what things would sound like in here, is humongous, meaning that whenever someone in the scene says something, their sound is going to leave their mouth and go all over this humongous, basically cavernous space and sound very different. So it's going to be like if the acoustic engineers, if these sound effects and sound designer and sound mixer people don't help out, it's going to be like you're seeing somebody talking in a small bedroom, but they sound like they're in an airplane hangar or sound like they're in a gymnasium or something like that. I think if that happened, you probably would be aware of it consciously. But even if you weren't aware of it consciously, these folks would say that you would still be distracted from the scene. You would be kind of disengaged from the scene, even if you didn't know that the reason why was because of this mismatch between what you were seeing and what you were hearing. So what these folks must do when this depicted scene's acoustics don't match the soundstage acoustics, so in other words, the depicted scene should be of a quiet bedroom, or at least people talking where the room is going to be very small, but they're on a sound stage, which is where a lot of this stuff is filmed, which are, these places are humongous. They have to make some sort of modification in the space so what you hear matches what you see. And in fact, you can see a little bit of this. Let me go back to this big image here. You can see a little bit of this. If you're able to look closely on your screen, you can see that they've actually placed something above the scene. Now, this could be lighting partly, so the scene is lit from above, but it also probably does provide some changes to the acoustics of the space. And that idea of having to change the acoustic space is something they need to do in every movie, in every TV show that you see that involves an interior shot, okay? And that's the job of Jay Patterson. He's what you call a sound mixer, and it involves a number of different processes that are involved. But what I'll be talking about today for Jay's job is that he is the one that has to make the recording of the actors in a scene sound like they're actually in the space that is being depicted in the video, in the film. Okay, so what he'll need to do is to look at that space that we just saw on the sound stage and make it sound like people are talking in a small room, despite the cavernous kind of structure of how the sound would normally sound in a place like that. And Jay says something really great that I thought was a really nice way of putting it. He says, you know, one thing you learn as soon as you start this job is that any space has its own signature. What he called it, an acoustic signature. Any space has a way of structuring sound that is, you know, kind of specific to it, that makes sense given its size. Okay, and his job, he felt, was to make sure that the space that was being filmed then had the acoustic signature it should, based on what the audience would be saying. And so this is what happens in every interior shot you ever see, whether it's in a Harry Potter film, whether it's in The Good Place, you know, that really popular show. Any interior scene is going to involve someone like Jay Patterson coming in there and changing the acoustics. So you can imagine, if you're into the making of the film or a TV, you know, sometimes they show you what the actual sound stage looks like. You find those mismatches between what's being depicted and what's behind it, right? There's got to be somebody there that's going to change the way things sound so it matches what's being seen. And for someone like Jay, who's been doing it for so long, what he would do is he would come into a room, you know, as they're first setting things up, as they're setting up the cameras, he would walk into the room for the first time, clap his hands once, like that, okay? And have a sense of then, just from that single hand clap and how the room structured the reflections from that hand clap, he would say, oh boy, this room has a lot of echo because it's actually in that cavernous soundstage, right? We need to put something above the action, above where the actors are going to be. We need to put things on the side of where the actors are going to be. All those sort of things. Much of what he does is done with blankets. And these are, like, you show me some of these blankets. They're basically thick, heavy blankets. I mean, you know, they have some sort of material inside, some sort of, I don't know if it's a metal or rubber or something like that, very dense rubber inside. But what these do is they do a great job of kind of offsetting any echoes that would be in the room. They kind of make it a much less echoey sort of place. And the other things that I wrote there is baffles, and those are in the previous image where I was showing you that soundstage. You saw that there were some wood walls there. Basically, they look like wood walls, except they don't have, you know, they're not actual walls that would ever be filmed or anything like that. And what he needs to do, you know, he said that the pressure in this context, the pressure is not only to get to change the sound so it matches what the audience will be seeing in the video, but to do it quickly, because he can't delay the filming. You know, as soon as the crew gets there and starts setting up the cameras and everything, he needs to put all those blankets and baffles in there in a way that can not only has to structure the sound, but can't be seen by the camera. So he has to move things around to make sure that when the camera's looking at the actors from this angle, that there's no blanket right behind it. They you know, the blankets really, if you ever go to a sound stage, you'll see the blankets look like this. They are ugly and very conspicuous. You know, they don't really, you know, it's not like they paint them to look like the walls of the room. These are the same blankets he uses on every shot. So they are, you know, you don't want them being seen by the camera. So he has to work very quickly. And, you know, later on, after he gets things set up, he will clap again to make sure things are sounding right, but he'll also have to make sure that things can look right when the cameras are on and not seeing the kind of mess that he's made with these blankets and baffles. And then after he does that, what he does is he also realizes he has to somehow capture the sound of this new space that he's created. So these days, they still use some of the old techniques, which I'll talk about later, but these days what they will do is they will put hidden little lapel mics that are like kind of this type of thing, except much smaller and much easier to hide. They will put those on the clothing of the actors that are being filmed, which will get the dialogue pretty well. You'll see there's a better way of getting dialogue that's kind of old school, which I'll tell you about in a second, but they'll use these sort of mics to some degree. They will also take little mics like this and put them in various positions in the room. And the purpose of those mics is to not capture the sound of the actors directly, but to capture the sound of the actors' voices after they've been reflected by the walls of the room, but also the blankets and all that sort of stuff. Those little microphones that are placed throughout the room are there to capture this acoustic space he's kind of created from scratch, okay? And so when you're listening to a movie, a video or whatever, you're not only hearing microphones that are designed to pick up the actor's speech directly, like this type of thing, you're also hearing microphones that are picking up the sound of the room as it changes the sound of the speech of the actors based on the reflections that are coming from its surfaces. Now, I was just thinking this. I listened at night. I very often watch movies and TV shows, kind of HBO shows, Netflix shows with headphones on. And I do this because sometimes my wife likes to read in bed while I like to watch an hour's worth of TV or so in bed. I was made so aware of this when I started listening to shows with headphones on. If you have headphones on, you can really hear how the actor does sound like they're in the space that's being depicted, right? So I'm watching Handmaid's Tale now. I don't know if you folks have watched that. It's pretty heavy stuff. Not sure I'd recommend it for everybody right now, but it's really well done. And, there's scenes that take place in a bedroom, scenes that take place in outside, of course, but also in kind of very large living rooms and theaters and things like that. And boy, they really, you can really hear how each of these spaces sounds different and how the characters' voices sound different in each of these spaces. It's really clear over headphones. If you get a chance to listen to a show over headphones, you can probably maybe introspect more in that context than you might otherwise. So it's pretty cool. Okay. So he records things like this, and then the mixing part of what he does is he kind of takes the sound from all these microphones, the sounds from the microphones that are placed on the actors, the sounds from the microphones that are placed around the room, and he kind of mixes them all together. And then his job is at that point is pretty much done, unless he has to do more of this later on because of a mistake. But boy, these guys do not make mistakes. They are paid very well. If you're looking for a job in Hollywood, sounds like a really cool job. He was saying, I said, do you ever have glitches in the recordings or anything like that? They said, no, we always record with 2 backups from the original recording. So as he's recording, he has 2 separate computers. He has 3 computers, one that's making the primary one, and then 2 others that are making backups. He said, we cannot afford to make mistakes. So they have to be very good at this. They have to be very good at placing the microphones, at placing the baffles, and then mixing all this together. And then based on that recording, he is pretty much done. And he gives these recordings to the next part of the sound production process. Which are my example of that is Sandy Berman, who you're seeing right there, is a sound designer. And what a sound designer does is he doesn't do the recording, he doesn't do the music of a film, but he is responsible for all other sounds in the film. So he is responsible for kind of making sure that the dialogue then matches up with what you're seeing. He's responsible for all the sound effects. He's responsible for filling in background sounds if he needs to, all these sorts of things. Much of his time is spent in the post-production phase of things. So this is after the sounds have actually been recorded, like by someone like Jay Patterson. And he needs to do 2 things in post-production that involve a lot of concern with what we're calling kind of the acoustic signatures of rooms. These 2 things are called Foley and looping. And you might have heard of Foley before. That's just basically sound effects. And we'll be talking about sound effects a little bit more in a second. But looping is something I want to actually talk about now. So Foley are the sort of sound effects that, as people are walking, he has to sometimes add footsteps and things like that. But what looping is basically a name for re-recording dialogue, re-recording the line readings by actors. So he will have to either bring actors back or find a way to get a recording of an actor based on, say, a line not being clear in the original recording. Hopefully Jay Patterson's done a good job and has recorded things as clearly as possible, but there's always something that needs to be re-recorded. So for example, there could be, if it's on location sort of filming, there could be like an ambulance siren in back or something in background, and you don't want that in Game of Thrones either. There's things that have to be recorded, so they have to bring the actors back in. And that's what looping is. I should just say very quickly, it's called looping because what they will do is the actor will come in, they will see a video of them actually saying the line again and again, and then their job would be to kind of synchronize their new version of that line that they have to re-record with what they're saying. So looping is kind of the name they give it because they're seeing the same line being said over and over again in the video that they're watching. And that's what looping is. Okay, so, he gave a lot of examples. He worked on a lot of different movies. I'm trying to remember the one that he worked. He worked on one with J-Lo and Mark Anthony, the one that they started their romance on. El Cantato, is that right? I can't remember what it's called, but he was doing that one. He had just finished that, I guess, when I talked to him, if I remember that correctly. And what he talked about was all the different ways that you can have a looping recording made to sound like it's part of the original filming. Okay, so you can imagine this. The actor comes in, all the filming's done, most of the filming's done, but the actor has to come in and re-say a line. You have to record that new line, and the question is, how do you make that line sound like it was actually spoken in the same room that the original filming took place, right? So it's going to be, in a studio or something like that. So somehow he needs to modify the sound of the actor in the looping studio so it sounds like it's actually part of the original filming. And he told me the different ways he does it. It depends, he says, on the budget of the production. So, for example, he worked on all these different types of shows and movies that had different types of budgets. Historically, soap operas. I don't know if you guys know what I think there's still some soap operas on. Those are very low budget. He worked on some of those, and what he said they would do then, if somebody had to come back and they had to do a Foley or a looping, is that they would use something called room tone recordings. And what room tone recordings are this? Basically, after any scene is filmed, the actors will be told to stand still, right where they are, and not say anything, but then a recording of about 30 seconds will be made just of the silent room, okay? However, they have to be good at this because they want the actors to be in the position that they are normally in during the scene that's being filmed, because their position, as it turns out, is going to have some effect on how these kind of ambient sounds of the rooms are being recorded. So basically, it's a recording of the kind of swishing sound you might hear in a room that's so quiet that you need to do this type of thing in order to hear normally, right? And then what they'll do is they'll take those recordings and then add them so that they are the background to the looped line that they had to newly record. Okay, so they bring in Jennifer Lopez. She has to say her line over again, and if she's in a soap opera, she says the line, and then to make it sound like she was saying this new line in the original scene, they will add this room tone recording to that. The other thing they can do, and this they actually did for that movie, El Cantato. Maybe someone can tell me if I'm getting that right or not. Sorry about that. It's called Worldizing, and this is a great story. You told me this one. What they did for that movie, I guess there's a scene, for those of you that know the film, where they get married in Mexico or somewhere, South Central America, where they get married out on a patio, I guess a plaza. They get married in a plaza, and the scene was filmed there. But there were some lines that they had to re-record, so they brought Jennifer Lopez in, and she did her looping thing. She sees herself on a big screen saying the lines, and then she has to say them over again and say them in a way that match, her mouth movements and all that sort of stuff. And now they have a recording of her, but it's not going to sound like that recording was on the plaza. So get this. This is what they did for this movie, and I guess they do this if they have the budget for it. They took her recording, and actually it was a few different lines, maybe some by her and some by other actors. They took these recordings, and they went back to this plaza in Mexico that they had done the filming in, the original filming in, and set up loudspeakers basically in positions where the actors were, and had these loudspeakers play out their looping recordings onto the plaza, and then record, have microphones back further that recorded how the plaza restructured the sound of the recorded dialogue. So they actually brought these looped recordings into the set, or into the space that they actually had the original film made. All right, and he said that, they gave us the money for this, and we know that works. That sounds good. And then they come back and they dub that now plaza restructured recording into the movie, and it sounds great. There's other ways of doing this too. Convolution, and basically that's actually a cheaper way of doing it. It's kind of more like room tone recordings. What they can do now is, and they do this a lot for TV shows, if they have a space that they use again and again, what they'll do is they'll take measurements, very accurate measurements of the room, say in a TV show, or The Handmaid's Tale, where there's a lot of scenes in the handmaid's bedroom, where she, people visit her and stuff like that. They will take very accurate measurements of the room, not only the dimensions of its, of its width and length and all that stuff, its height, but also of the things that are in the room, a bed, a table, things like that, a bathtub. And they will do some kind of mathematical calculations to determine how that room should actually change sound that's created in the room. And they will use those sort of calculations to change the re-recorded, the dub lines of Elizabeth Moss, in this case, the actress that's in the Handmaid's Tale. So Elizabeth Moss would come in, she'd re-say the line, and then they would take these computer programs and make these computer programs to make it sound like those lines were originally recorded in that room where the whole scene was originally recorded. That's what convolution is. So I said, this is amazing. I had no idea, Sandy, that there was so much effort put into, making, kind of these fixing recordings, these looping fixes. So they sounded like they were in the original room. Which is your favorite out of those? Is it the room tone? Is it the worldizing? Is it convolution? He said, well, worldizing is the best, if we can do it. But there's another one that I like just as much that I haven't named yet. And that is actually recreating the original acoustic space in the soundstage looping studio. So here's what they do. If it were up to Sandy, okay, say Sandy's working on Handmaid's Tale, or whoever's working on Handmaid's Tale now, what they would do is they would actually, the soundstage is going to be someplace different from the original filming. They would do is they would actually take the soundstage where the person's going to do the looping and put things in the soundstage to make it seem like that is the exact same room acoustically as the one they filmed in. So they put, if there's a bed over here, they might put a big board with a blanket on it. If there's walls over here, they would put you know, kind of reflected surfaces there, you know, the other sorts of objects that approximate the sort of objects that are in the original scene, and then have Elizabeth Moss come in and do the recordings, the looping recordings in their studio with these objects and baffles and walls around her that are very, very much like exactly the sort of things that occurred in the original film space. So he likes to, in his studio, to recreate the space as much as possible. And I said, so yeah, he's got, just very quickly, he's got movable baffles and blankets and reflectors and things like that. And I said, does it really make a difference? He says, oh yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. Boy, you know, I think he thinks any sound engineer could consciously, okay, be able to tell the difference between room tone recordings versus the preferred either worldizing or the literal recreation of the space. He said, you know, when it comes down to it, when it comes to sound, there's nothing like the real thing. There's nothing like being able to make a space that is as close as possible to the acoustic space in which the scene had originally been filmed in. And I said, wow, this is really interesting. When I was talking to these guys, at first I really thought, are these really, I mean, are they worrying about these things too much? Is the auditory system so good that it can pick out these subtle differences? And everybody I talked to in this field said yes. And you realize it more and more as reproduction systems, as you know, the sound reproduction they do in movie theaters, the sound reproduction you get in your you know, surround sound stereo at home. Boy, they have to really work hard because the quality of home listening has gotten so good. Even, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you know, the little speaker you have, if you don't have a surround sound system, you just have a flat screen TV, the little speaker, tiny little flat speaker that's in that TV is so much better than the sort of loudspeaker that I used to have in my old TVs when I was growing up. I don't know if you've ever seen those old TVs, those big boxy things. You'd think that, you know, you could put a nice speaker in there, a nice, you know, high quality speaker. TV sound is so much better than it used to. Just trust me on this. And even those speakers in your flat screen TV you probably have at home, okay? Those are speakers that are good enough to really recreate the space that these folks are so worried about. It's not, they're not just doing this for each other and for trying to, you know, get voted as for Emmys and Oscars and stuff like that. They really want to make sure that the audience feels like they are in the scene with the actors. One just quick kind of aside here. I asked him if he thought, so you know, we talked about expertise. I said, clearly you and Jay are people who really learned to listen for these things and can hear when a recording isn't in the right, isn't in the right place. But can actors ever tell? And he gave me this example. I don't know if you guys know this actor. Oops, sorry. This is Robert Duvall. Do you recognize him at all? If you are a fan of the old Godfather movies, he's in all three of those. He's in a number of old movies that are considered very high quality. He's a wonderful actor. He's, you know, kind of my generation, one of those, you know, we had so much respect for him. I'm not sure if he's acting anymore. He's quite old now, but just a terrific actor. And Sandy said, you know, he worked with him in a number of different movies and felt that he was a real perfectionist. He's a nice guy, but he cares so much about his performance that he would have problems doing looping because of how the recordings were presented to him in the looping studio. So, for example, when all these examples I gave, Elizabeth Moss, Jennifer Lopez, Robert Duvall are in the looping studio, they're listening usually over headphones to the lines that they're reading, or that had been recorded, even though they're a little garbled or something, they're listening. And what they will use for those headphones are the recordings that were made just with the microphones that are, you know, attached to their bodies when they were made. So what they are hearing is not the line that was actually recorded and capturing the entire acoustic space. It only captured, you know, basically what was being said right here by the actors. And Sandy said Robert Duvall had a terrible time with this. He said, I can't stand listening to my voice when it sounds like it's taken out of context. It distracts me. It sounds like it's too sterile. I need to hear my voice, as if it's in the room that I'm watching myself in. I can't do it otherwise. So what he used to do is he would listen to his own voice in the original filming with one ear, and then he would take the headphones off his other ear so he could listen to how his voice sounded in this recreated space. And only when he did that was he able to, kind of match things up well and convey the same emotion, do the same type of acting he was doing. He actually needed to hear his voice in a normal acoustic space for him to act, which I thought was really interesting. Now, I'm so disappointed because right here when I give this talk, I usually love to do this demonstration, and I can't do it with Zoom. I don't know if you know about this, but Zoom doesn't allow you to present films that have copyright. Because I tried this last quarter and it wouldn't do it at all. It wouldn't show. I have this great old movie called Mary Poppins. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. There was a sequel that came out with what's her name, Emily Blunt as Mary Poppins. That's actually nice. My wife and I saw it a couple of years ago. We thought it was good. But the original Mary Poppins with Julie Andrews is also kind of a pretty charming old movie. And I have a copy of that because my kids used to love it. And what I was able to do with that copy was move between the original soundtrack and the dubbed language soundtrack. I guess Spanish, that was one of the languages. I think French was also on there. And I would show the same scene with the original soundtrack and the English, and then the Spanish language dubbed onto it. And certainly you're aware that, the lips don't match up completely right, but they do a pretty good job. It doesn't look like she's actually speaking in Spanish, but it looks like kind of she's speaking. But what I think is so noticeable when I do that demonstration is that you can hear the difference between the acoustic space she is in that was filmed for the original English version of the movie versus the dub version. Because back then, and actually probably this wasn't done when the filming was originally made, but we're talking probably done in the 80s or 90s. Back then, when they did a foreign language soundtrack, they wouldn't try to recreate the acoustic space. I mean, if you were watching the foreign version soundtrack of a movie, you would hear all the sound effects and that sort of stuff. But if you listen just to the voice, it doesn't sound live. It doesn't sound like the dialogue is being spoken in the same room. It almost sounds like it's too sterile, like Robert Duvall said. It's like it's kind of too pure. It doesn't sound like it's in a real room. And if you go back and forth between Spanish and English, you can hear that. Oh, I did this recently. My wife and I were watching this Israeli show, Fauda. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's really great. It's really, really well done. But you can watch it with English subtitles, or you can watch it in its original Israeli and Arabic. And if you go back and forth, you can hear, even this more modern show, that the English subtitles, they don't sound like they're recorded in the same room. It's especially conspicuous if you're wearing headphones. So if you have a chance, go to a movie on Netflix or Amazon. If you can wear headphones or something like that on your computer, that's even better. If you can find a way going back between the foreign language version and the original version, you'll not only hear that clearly, it matches better with the video, but you can hear there's something very sterile about the version that's been re-recorded for foreign listeners. Okay, let's take a little break here and see if there's any questions and do another poll. Looks like there's some questions. Great. Nassim said Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando, not sure why you made that. What time was that? That was 5 minutes ago. Oh, yeah. So Marlon Brando is in the Godfather movies. I guess it's the first two, right? Or the first one at least. And Robert Duvall plays his kind of advisor and then the advisor of the Al Pacino characters, if you're interested in that. Yes, it's a great TV show. Not sure which one you're talking about, but thanks for the comment. Aya says, don't music producers also? Yes, music produce. So this is something that is done with music. And this is really, really interesting. Say, maybe you guys are into live recordings, live concert recordings and stuff like that. I still think they do these, right? Even though music is so different now. Is there a, yeah, there's a live, okay, so say, I think there's a live concert album of Beyonce, for an example. Isn't there something that came out recently? I know there was a concert film, but I believe there's also an album that comes with it. And so when they do those recordings, clearly they want them to be as clear as possible. So they will do part of the recording from the stage itself and with the instruments and right from the microphones and all that sort of stuff. But they will also do it from behind the theater, so they capture the live performance sort of feel of what's going on. Okay. This is a little secret. I hope I'm not bursting your bubble. But on some of these concert albums, what they need to do is re-record something, because for whatever reason, maybe a little mistake was made in an instrumental part, or maybe the balance wasn't quite right, so the guitar solo isn't loud enough, right? And so what they'll do is they'll actually bring the guitarist back and have him or her re-record the guitar solo in the studio, and to get it right, to make sure it matches with the music and all that sort of thing, and make sure it's loud enough. And what they need to do to make sure it mixes well with the live concert music is they'll have to make that instrument sound like it's back in that theater. And that's actually a relatively simple thing to do, to make it sound like it's in a theater, but to make it sound like it's in that theater specifically is tricky. And they do things like room tone recordings for concert albums and things like that too. They probably wouldn't bring him back into the theater itself, because unless they have an audience in there, because there's a huge difference between the sound, as you can imagine, of an empty theater versus a crowded, with audience theater. It's a huge difference in how the sound is shaped by the bodies of the audience. But they will do things like they'll take recordings of the theater before the music is played and after the music is played, so they can add that to the kind of new recordings they have to do to fix the original recording. Great question. Other questions about this? Other questions about any of this TV, movie, and music recording sort of stuff? I think this sort of stuff is so interesting. And boy, I'll tell you, talking to these guys too, by the way, they love what they do, and they are so excited to talk about it. They don't usually have people ask about this, These are not the people that become famous, even though they do get, Oscars and Emmys. I think both these guys had won awards before I talked to them even. They're recognized for their skill, but to actually have someone to talk about, all the nuances of everything they do, they're really bright, articulate guys. It was really a joy talking to these folks. Anything else? Okay, let's do our poll question then. All right. Oh, shoot. Oh, shoot. Hold on, everything. Do I have a question for you? We have echolocation cues. No, I don't, actually. All right. Sorry about that. I don't have a question. I do have many more questions, but all the questions I've asked, the only questions I have left are things that I haven't taught yet. So I'll have to save a couple of those for our next little break. I apologize. Didn't know it was going to take that long to get through that slide. Sorry. Okay, so we won't do a poll this time. No problem. That's fine. We can just continue. All right, so let's continue. There we are. And what I'm going to do is move into another thing another topic that I think that the entertainment industry teaches us about sound. Oh, no, actually, this is nice. I have a little demonstration of hearing rooms that was based on an old experiment that we did. Oh, this will be fun. All right, here, this will be good. After I talked to these folks, I was just really interested because nobody had actually ever done this before in perceptual psychology. I asked the question about, can we recognize sounds by the way can we recognize rooms by the way they structure sound? So here's the question I'm asking. Because boy, these guys that talk about the acoustic signature of rooms and are so attentive to making sure they get this right in movies and TV shows, they would absolutely say, yes, you're doing this all the time. And even if you're not able to do it consciously, your unconscious brain is able to pick out these things and pick out when there's discrepancies between the sound signature of a room and the room you're seeing. It's absolutely critical. Your brain is good at this, even if you're not quite conscious of this fact. So I was interested in whether you can actually become a little conscious of this by asking subjects whether they could recognize rooms by the way those rooms structured sounds. So can we recognize rooms based on how they structured emitted sounds? And so what we decided to do is go around the campus and find 4 different rooms that were very, very different acoustically. And you can see those 4 rooms there. You can see there's a bathroom, right? This is a bathroom in the basement of Olmsted near where our laboratory is. This is a classroom on the 1st floor of Olmsted, just a regular size classroom. This, I don't know if you would recognize. This is the old gymnasium. The reason why we're using it is because it's not used very much anymore. I assume it's still there. It's near the Commons. It's near where, you know, where it's near like the Black Student Association's offices are and other kind of group other association and group offices are. It's the building behind that. And then this is a laboratory room, not ours, another room down the hall. That's just very small. It's kind of like the size of maybe a walk-in closet or something like that. And so we had 4 different rooms, and we had to decide. We decided in order to make sure that what we were doing is capturing the sound of the room and not the emitted sound itself. Is that in each of these rooms, what we did is we recorded sounds coming from a loudspeaker that was always positioned the same distance in front of a microphone. Okay, so that's what you're seeing here. This is obviously in the gym. This little loudspeaker was mounted on a tripod, and it was, I think, 5 feet away from the microphones. We put many different sounds through this because we weren't sure the type of sound that was going to be best for allowing the room to kind of reveal its sound signature. So we used multiple sounds. We used the sound of a recorded voice of somebody speaking, the sound of a computer-generated sound called a white noise sound, which sound, well, you know what that is now. It's a ch-ch, like that type of sound, and a lot of other things. And then the recordings we made, I think that Serena told you about. I believe that was one of the things we discussed that she might talk about. I haven't talked to her since yesterday. But these are recordings that were made by microphones that are actually put in the ear canals of a person. So for all these recordings, we had one of our research assistants put these little specialized microphones in their ears. They're very comfortable. You know, it's kind of like wearing earplugs, and one in each ear. And what that does, these binaural recordings, can I see a thumbs up? Did she talk about this yesterday? Somebody? No, I don't know if I can see a thumbs up. All right, I can't see it right now anyway. Well, I hope she did. It doesn't make too much of a difference. I'll just tell you very quickly. These are little microphones that go in the ear canals of a person, or sometimes a mannequin head is used. And what these will do, these recordings, is not only capture sound left and right direction like stereo will, but also front and back. Okay, so if you listen to recordings of these binaural recordings, you can hear left and right, but also front and back, and also up and down. So they basically are like almost a virtual reality for sound. And actually, these are now incorporated into virtual reality systems. If the recordings are made like this and you're listening to these recordings over headphones, it's almost like you're there if you close your eyes. It really is very compelling. And there are demonstrations of this online. If Serena didn't tell you about them, I can post a few. They're really cool. I think you'll really enjoy these. But the reason we use them is because they are a really nice way of capturing sounds that are coming from all directions. They're a very vivid way of capturing sounds that are, for example, reflecting off the walls of a gymnasium or reflecting off the walls of a bathroom or a classroom or something like that. And so then we took these recordings back to the lab, played them for people, and showed them these pictures of these different rooms, okay, right here, and asked them, you're going to hear a sound, and it's going to be the same sound, but it's going to be made in these different rooms. Tell us which room you think this sound was recorded in. The sounds are going to be these little burst sounds, like that, and tell us which room you think it was recorded in. Now, if you're listening through headphones, this actually might work for you. When I do this in lecture and everyone's in the audience not listening through headphones and the sounds are coming out of these mediocre loudspeakers that are, towards the top of the room, you can hear some rooms, but other rooms are hard. If you're listening through loudspeakers, you may be able to do this. So which room do you think this was recorded in? And just maybe make a note for yourself. Oops. Hopefully you can hear that okay. I'll play it again. Okay. And now here's another room, and you can figure out which room this was recorded in. Is this the bathroom or the classroom or the gymnasium or the little tiny lab room? Which room was that recorded in? Hopefully you can hear a difference between these two. And play that again. And here's a third room. Which one is this? The bathroom or the classroom or the gymnasium or the office, or not the office, the lab room? Ah! I can do it. And then here's the final room. Which one is this? Classroom, the bathroom, the gymnasium, or the lab room? Yeah, that's really good. Okay, I'm going to play these all for you again. Hopefully you can hear these okay. You're hearing them okay. If you're wearing headphones, you should be able to do this pretty well. Which one is this? Is it the bathroom, classroom, gymnasium, or lab room? Okay. And which one is this? Which one is this? And which one is this? Okay. Let's see if you got them right. This first one is, in fact, the bathroom. Did you get that right? Let's see. Can I see? Let me just do this for a second. Can you do thumbs up for me? Can you guys hit thumbs up? Just want to see how it looks on the screen here. Thumbs up. I see one person with a thumbs up. Good, 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 good. Okay. Great. Thank you. How many people thought this was the bathroom? How many people got this right? Okay. How many people thought this was the classroom? Number 2. Thumbs up. Anybody? No? No one got that right? Oh, okay. Yeah, good. Some people did. How many people thought this was the gymnasium? And if you're not wearing headphones, it's not that obvious. Anybody? No? Okay. Could you put a thumbs up if you have headphones, if you're listening through headphones right now? Nobody. Oh, Alex is. Oh, whoa! Everybody is. Okay, so this doesn't sound like the gymnasium to you with headphones? No? All right, fine. And this is the lab room. So it went 1, 2, 3, 4, just like the pictures are 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Well, maybe it didn't work that well. That's fine. I don't think we need to spend more time getting your responses for that. But I will tell you happily that when we did this in the laboratory and there weren't distractions and people had good quality headphones on and stuff like that, people were outstanding at identifying the rooms. They were really, really impressive. In fact, the sound you just heard was this one right here. And as you can see, when it came to identifying the gym, they were 90-something% correct. When it came to identifying the bathroom, they were 80%, 70% for identifying the classroom, and it looks like 85% correct at identifying the small laboratory room. And don't forget, if they were guessing, they'd be at 25% for each of these. So they are really, really impressive when this is done well. So I think we can make a conclusion that, yeah, people are very good at recognizing the rooms based on reflected sound. And I should just say one thing very quickly. that we did a follow-up experiment where we actually got rid of the original sound, the ch-ch-ch part, and just played the little reflections, the little echo parts at the end of all these recordings, and people could still do it by hearing less than 2 seconds of it. They weren't as accurate as I just showed you, but they were certainly better than chance. So not only can we recognize rooms, or at least these 4 rooms, based on how they structure sound, but we can do it based on very, very little acoustic information. We can do this very, very well. So I think this, kind of really is consistent with what folks like Sandy Berman and Jay Patterson are saying about this sort of thing. It does seem to work really well. Okay, let's go on and continue our discussion here and talk about another thing that these folks taught me, which is something that I think science is now kind of catching up to. It's one of those situations where these folks that are specialists in a craft, I guess, sound recording for movies and TV, know more, I think, than the scientists do. And they absolutely said that we are very sensitive to where a sound is and where we are in a room. So not only are we sensitive to what room we're in, we're sensitive to where we are in a room. And that is based on a really kind of interesting demonstration that has to do with the way video is recorded in TV and movies. So it has to do with, this is going back to Jay Patterson. He's the one that told me about this. It has to do with the type of microphones that are actually being used in these recordings. So I did say that they absolutely do use these lapel mics. They use microphones that are all around, but they also use an old style of microphone that creates a kind of unique problem. The problem that's it creates is called ambient shift, which I will discuss in just a second. But this ambient shift is basically a result of using an old type of microphone technique, but they still like to use a lot, called shotgun microphones. Okay. Oh, I have this image up here because this is an old TV show that Jay was working on at the time. Oh God, Without a Trace, I don't know if you've ever seen this, probably not. Your parents might know it, Without a Trace. It was on for a long time. It was kind of like Law and Order sort of show. And these are 2 of the actors. He was working on that show as I was interviewing him, so that's why we talked about it at the time. But importantly, what you see there above the image of the actors is a microphone called a shotgun microphone. And you can see why it's called a shotgun microphone. It kind of looks like a gun, like a rifle, a little bit. And they've been using shotgun microphones for ages. In fact, the type of microphone I showed you that had its shadow mistakenly projected onto that old Ed Wood movie image was kind of like a shotgun microphone. It's a type of microphone that hangs over the actors and shifts back and forth. Here, I'll use this. It shifts back and forth, okay? So here I am, Rosenblum, the actor, and I'm talking with, who am I talking with? Angelina Jolie. There you go, like in the book. You know this from the book, of course. The microphone shifts back and forth between when I say my line and Angelina says her line, okay? Goes back and forth between me and Angie. She likes it when I call her Angie. This is still a technique that's used. Yes, they do record from these microphones and other microphones that are on the floor, but they find that these microphones are often the most clear. So they use these shotgun microphones still. They were using it certainly when they did this show in the late 2010 time, right? And as far as I know, they still use these sort of microphones, these shotgun microphones. But the thing about a shotgun microphone is that it actually, even though it records things very clearly from the actors, it records in a very small range of space, okay? Meaning that when, I think I have this image of the space here. Do I? No. Okay, I don't. I'll show this to you in a second. But the shotgun microphone records what's right in front of it and just a little area of what's behind it. What it doesn't record are things on the side. It's one of the reasons it's such a clear microphone, because if you kind of aim it towards the mouth, it gets a really clear recording of a dialogue, okay? So actually there's somebody who controls the microphone on a long boom. They have a little wheel, and they're the ones that have to turn it between me and Angie. I say my dialogue, but Angie, I'm a married man. I have children. I'm sorry. I can't have a relationship with you. And Angie says, but I beg you, Professor Rosenblum, I beg you. I've loved you from afar for ages. I'm sorry, Angie, no. Goes back and forth like this, okay? It records from a very small area. That's what we call an artifact. That's kind of like one of the consequences of using a microphone from that. It records me and what's behind me when it's pointing towards me, and it's going to record Angie and what's behind Angie when it's pointing towards her, okay? And so if I have something different behind me, so like say we're standing on the edge of my bed because she's inappropriately come into my bedroom, and it's pointing towards me, it's going to record me as well as how the sound from my mouth is reflected from the things that are behind me, which happen to be a bed, tapestry on the wall, maybe a lot of soft carpeting there, where when it swings to her, it records her voice and how her voice is structured by things behind her, which is going to include, say, a hard wall, a mirror, maybe hard furniture that's behind her. And so as it's swinging back and forth, it's going to make it sound like we're in two different rooms, okay? So almost every room, if you want to look around the room you're in right now, you'd see that any room has a different set of surfaces in it, you know, like hard surfaces, soft surfaces. So you know, if you're sitting in a room now that has a you know, couch and carpeting in one area, you're going to look around the room and you see, yeah, that doesn't have the couch. That doesn't have a couch there. That actually has a wall and harder surfaces. So every room has differentially reflected areas to it. And what happens with the shotgun microphone, because it records in a narrow area, and that's what this is showing down here, it's recording in a very narrow area, just that little egg shape right there, that when you shift it back and forth, it can make it sound like the actors are actually being recorded in two separate rooms. It's facing me, and I sound like I'm in a bedroom because I have a bed behind me. It's facing Angie, and it makes her sound like she's in a, I don't know, a garage or something like that with a lot of hard surfaces around it. Okay, so the mic shift can cause the actors to sound as if they're in separate rooms. And what Jay told me is like, if you just record like that, that's going to be a real problem. You do not want the actors to sound like they're in different rooms. So what they have to do is, in addition to modifying the space so it sounds like the space that's being seen, they have to equalize the reflections in both areas of the room. So in order to make Angie sound like she's in the same room as me, they might take some blankets and put it on top of the mirror or something like that. So there's less sound reflections from that hard surface of the mirror. In order to equalize this, my side, in order to make it sound like it's in the same room as Angie, they might put a hard surface in there so it sounds a little bit more consistent with what the shotgun microphone is recording with Angie. Okay? So that gives you some idea of all the nuances that have to be kind of dealt with as they're making these sort of recordings. Okay, so let's take a little break here, and I can ask you a question now. But let's see if there's any comments you have here. Yes, she did. I think Ralph, I appreciate it. Keep making these comments even if they are long before we take our break. That's fine. I think Ralph is responding to my question about whether Beyonce made a live album, and I think she did. So I think there is a movie video of this concert, but I think you can also listen to it. Stream it or whatever. And I promise you, when you're doing so, you can, part of what you're hearing is something that's been re-recorded for the purposes of making the live album sound more perfect. And they have to consider the same types of things. So thanks for that, Ralph. Other questions about this sort of stuff, either about hearing rooms or hearing mic positions or something like that, hearing how this is a tiny bit complicated, this ambient shift thing. As long as you're understanding that any single room has multiple properties of sound reflection, some soft, some hard, so that they need to be equalized in a recording because of this shotgun microphone. You get the idea. Okay. In fact, let's ask a quick question about that, just so we can get some more questions in our notes here. So you should have no problem with this one. The question is this: ambient sound shift, which you just learned about, is A, a byproduct of recording actors with a shotgun microphone. B, can make two characters in a scene sound like they're in two separate rooms, ambient sound shift, okay? Or C, shows that the brain is sensitive to the position in a room from which one is listening, okay? Or D, all of the above. There you go, shouldn't be a hard one. And while you're answering that, I'm gonna play around a little bit. Let's see what we got here. Yeah. Yeah, okay, you're doing great. Any other people want to answer? I've got, good. Shoot. All right. Good. I'm going to end it here. I think you did great. So I'll share the results. The answer is of course, the answer is D, all of the above. And it is the case that these ambient sound shifts will, it's a byproduct of the shotgun microphone because it only kind of records sound in one direction and therefore in one location in the room. It can make two characters sound like they're in separate rooms. I said that about me and Angie being in separate rooms if we don't kind of compensate for the shotgun microphone problem. And it shows that people actually are sensitive to different rooms, different areas of rooms making different sorts of reflections. And so the correct answer in this case is D, all of the above. Great job here. All right, any questions before we just kind of finish up our lecture for today? Good. Then if there's no more questions, what I will do is finish our lecture as a donkey. Okay. Oh, I like this donkey. That is one cute donkey. Can you see my ears there? Yeah, look at that. Like his eyes. You can smile? Yep, good. Okay, this is great. This will keep you awake, huh? Donkey's teaching your class. So let's go ahead and share my screen. And what I'd like to talk about is another quick experiment that kind of demonstrates some of these principles, something that we did. And I know this kind of sounds like that I'm just spending time with experiments that we did in my lab, but this is just a very small part of the book. Let's talk a little bit about this. What we were interested in is, given what Jay Patterson said about being able to recognize different areas of rooms based on sound reflections, we just did a very simple experiment where we asked people to determine what position in a room they are in based on reflected sound. And so it was important for us to make sure that the way they were able to hear this was based on sound reflections or room reflections, not based on sound sources. So here's what we did. That classroom you saw before? We removed all the chairs and everything else that was from that, and then brought in subjects who were sitting on a cart that moved around the room while they wore blindfolds and headphones for much of what was going on. They removed the headphones for the actual judgments, but it was important for us to keep headphones on them while we're moving them around. And we moved them to one of 9 positions in the room. We moved them to the front left, or the front middle of the room, the front rear, or the middle, or a left or center, or middle right, or the back left, back middle, and back right. And they aren't walking around, they're moving around on these carts. Believe it or not, they were very good-natured about this. It sounds like it'd be a pretty unpleasant experiment to be in, but they handled it well. Oh, I forgot to mention this part. In order for them to be confused, in order for them to really be making these judgments based on sound, we had to spin them around in between trials. So imagine being this experiment. We spin you around, you're wearing headphones, you're wearing blindfold. We then put you in one of these positions, say it's in the back left of the room. Okay, that's not the actual room, by the way. That's our laboratory. But then we put them in the back left part of the room, and then we stop them there. We have them take off their headphones, and then we present a sound over a loudspeaker that fills up the room, but should fill it up in a way that tells them where they are located. Okay? So what we did is we moved the sound source around with the listener. And I should say, we used lots of different sounds. Before I just mentioned that we used a noise from a loudspeaker. We also had them echolocate in other parts of the experiment. In a different experiment, we had them echolocate. We had them press a little clicker down here just to see if how much information we needed to be able to allow them to do these things. And what we found is, regardless of the type of sound that was being emanated from their position, they were at better than chance levels at judging where they were in the room, okay? In other words, they could identify their position based on the sound reflections. And imagine, if you were to right now go to the back corner of the room you're in and say, testing 1, 2, testing, testing, or click, click, or ch-ch-ch, you might have a sense you're in a different location in that room than if you're in the middle of the room and did the same thing. And again, it's important for us to be sure that this has to do with how the room is structuring the reflected sound, and not something like, well, I know the fan's over there and I'm this close to it. So it had to be a very silent room. This room was not making any sounds. We made sure that if they're able to do it, they were able to do it only from how a sound that was following them around, that was always in the same position relative to them, was structuring sound in the room that was then coming back to them and telling them where they were located in the room. So Jay Patterson is absolutely correct. Another one of these intuitions that these folks have absolutely correct, and that tell us that, yeah, you can identify where you are located in a room based on reflected sound. Okay, let's see where we are here. Let's end class here today. I think there's a lot of information that went on. I will continue talking about reflected sound next class, and then start talking about some of the baseball players that I thought it would be fun to talk about on Tuesday. Okay, so this is a good place to end for today. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week. Oh, there is a question here. Just very quickly, let me see if this is an important question for me to answer here. Oh, Ralph is laughing. Okay. Great. Thank you. Have a good weekend, everybody.